Okay, so our first group of biological molecules are the carbohydrates, all right? And to give you an idea where the word comes from, because again, I kind of like to do this wordplay and it helps you to remember carbohydrate. So carbo refers to the element carbon. Hydrate, well, we just talked about, hydrate refers to water. And no matter what the carbohydrate, you can always break it down into some uh, ratio of carbon to water. So if you look at these little molecules, you'll see that there's a carbon and an HOH. And so that's your water. Even though it's not really water, it's the ratio of water. So there's a carbon with a hydrogen and an OH attached, and this has that ratio CH2O. And so the first group of carbohydrates we're going to talk about are the monomers, right? So these are the single units that join together to form the bigger polymer, right? And the monomers of carbohydrates are called monosaccharides. And this comes from mono meaning one and saccharide, well, meaning sweet. I think it's a Greek word. And so these are essentially the monosaccharides and disaccharides represent our simple carbohydrates. When you think about the food that you eat, the simple carbs, right, are commonly referred to as your sugars. And so you've got the monomers like fructose and glucose. And there's another form of glucose here. It doesn't matter. You don't have to know the difference, but you can see this one's called alpha glucose. This one's called beta glucose. They're just a little bit different, but essentially the same thing. But what you do see here is that they have these very unique ring-like structures. And in our course, we often won't draw them with every single atom that you see. So more simply, we draw glucose as this kind of hexagon. And you'll notice in the one corner, there's an oxygen atom. So here's that oxygen atom. And so we typically draw it like this. It's just a very simplified form of glucose. And you notice that it's a six-sided ring. So they are ring-like structures. This fructose over here is a five-sided. And so we often draw it like this, kind of like a pentagon, right? And that's how they're often drawn. And that goes for the disaccharides as well. So disaccharide, di meaning two, right? And saccharide meaning sweet. But in this case, they consist of two monomers chemically bonded together. All right. And they're chemically bonded by a very specific type of bond called by an ester bond. And this ester bond is something that we need to know. So again, go to your flashcards, right? Your little glossary. This ester bond is essentially a carbon, oxygen, carbon bond. And you can see it if I outline it here, all right? And you can see it here, all right? And so again, in simplicity, we don't always draw the carbon atoms. We need to know that they're at each one of these little intersections, each one of these little vertexes of the shape would be a carbon atom, but we don't often draw them. But if I were to put them in now, you could see that COC, and it is a very important bond that joins many biological molecules together, specifically carbohydrates being one of them. All right. And if you want a definition for the monosaccharides, well, they are just single unit carbohydrates. All right. Consisting of a ring structure. Consisting of a ring-like structure. All right. So those are our simple carbohydrates and our group of monosaccharides and disaccharides. And essentially, the most important function that they have in our body is they are our immediate source of energy. Immediate source of energy for all cells. Sorry, I just got to squeeze this in there, for all cells. All right, that's their function. And most importantly, or most specifically, I should outline glucose, right? Glucose is our primary source of energy, right? This guy right here, this is our primary source of energy for every cell in our body. And we'll see that later on in chapter 6. All right, but there's different types of disaccharides, which essentially our body just breaks them down to get glucose. There's lactose. Maybe you are familiar with where you might come across these different sugars: lactose, maltose, sucrose. I'll pause the video, give it some thought, and then start the video to find out the answers. Where do we find these different disaccharides? Well, perhaps you're familiar. Lactose is our sugar that we find in our milk, breast milk or cow's milk or any mammal. Maltose, this is a disaccharide that we use in the making of beer and wine, right? So it's the sugar that we give to yeast, and they feed on that sugar, producing the ethanol and the carbon dioxide when we're making beer. And finally, sucrose is just simply table sugar. So it's our refined white table sugar that you dump on your cereal or put on whatever you put on. All right, those are our simple carbohydrates: monosaccharides, disaccharides. And again, if you got questions, pause the video, write down your questions, things you want to ask about, bring that to class. Okay, our second group of carbohydrates are polymers. These are the macromolecules, and these are often what you would refer to as our complex carbohydrates, because these are massive molecules, complex carbohydrates. They are, as we said before, macromolecules. They are polymers, right? Made from many repeating units. They're huge. When you look at these molecules over here, and what I want you to keep in mind is that they are monomers, they are polymers that are made from repeating units of monomers, but the monomer is specifically glucose. Specifically glucose. All right. That is the building block to the complex carbohydrates. So it is the monomer. All right. And the four complex carbohydrates, the four polymers, are starch, cellulose, glycogen, and chitin. And we're going to break these up. These two are plant. All right. So found in plants. And these bottom two are found in animals. But what's interesting is each has one that plays both a role with respect to the storage of energy, and each has one that plays a role to structural aspects of a cell, all right, or of an organism. So in the case of the plant, starch is, I'll do this in green. So starch is the storage form of glucose. So in a sense, it's kind of like our long-term store of energy for a plant, long-term store of energy. So when you think of starchy foods like a potato or, root type plants, they're starchy, they're full of starch, complex carbohydrate, and that when we eat, of course, we're going to break that starch down into glucose, but the plant has made an effort to store all this glucose as a molecule of starch. And here you can see the individual glucose molecules joined together, that hexagon ring with the ester bond linking the two together. But it's not just two, it's literally thousands and thousands and thousands making, and here we go, a starch granule in a potato tuber. I never even looked at that very closely. um, okay, now the corresponding in animals is glycogen. This is our storage form of glucose. And again, it's our long-term storage, right? And every single cell in our body stores sugar as glycogen. So in every single cell of your body, you're going to find glycogen granules. Um, but some cells tend to store a lot more. So, I'm going to pause the video and I want you to think of which cells demand a lot of energy and would likely store a lot of glucose as glycogen. All right, so think about that. Pause the video. Well, if you thought muscles, yes, muscles have a lot of glycogen. Our muscles do a lot of work. They require a lot of energy, and so they have a lot of stores of glycogen. And another group of cells in our body, the liver. The liver is one of the biggest organs in your body, and it has a lot of functions. It does a lot of work and hence requires a lot of energy. Of course, your brain as well would be another good one. But every cell in the body has glycogen, and you can see it's a little bit different. It tends to have more branches in it than starch. Starch tends to have fewer branches. All right. But it's fairly similar. You can see the glucose molecules are linked in the same way, right? But if you look at this picture down here, you can see it just branching in many different directions, and starch doesn't have that same level of branching to it. So there's a little slight difference. That's an important thing to pick up. It can help you identify them on a test or questions on assignments. Now, I said the other two are structural in their function. So they're not for energy, they're structural. Cellulose is the structural component of cell walls in plants. If you remember from grade school, plant cells don't have, animal cells don't have a cell wall, but plants have a cell wall, and the structural component of that cell wall is cellulose. Okay, so that's the role of cellulose in plants. In animals, not in us, but in many insects and arthropods. So chitin makes up so it's a structural component in animals, structural component of some animals, making up exoskeletons of insects and basically arthropods as a whole. So insects are arthropods. So that includes things like spiders, crabs, and crustaceans, right? That's what makes up their exoskeleton. And that's different, like if you're a crab or a crustacean, that's different than, say, a clam or an oyster, if you remember from Biology 11, in which their shell may be primarily made of calcium carbonate and some other minerals. Chitin is a carbohydrate. So again, you can sort of see it's a little bit different. Here we've got the beta version of the glucose, and there's definitely some other structures that are involved. Now, for test purposes, these two are fundamentally the most important, and especially glycogen, because this is, of course, on human anatomy and physiology, has nothing to do with plants, but these things will play important roles when we get into talking about our digestive system and foods that we eat and what role starch plays in our diet, and also cellulose. We'll talk about those and maybe some questions you could bring to class that you have, or maybe you know things about those and you want to offer those up. All right, that's the end of our notes. So please do bring questions, curiosities, things that you want to talk about in class, and things that I can help make connections to as we go through the material. All right, see you tomorrow.